A very warm welcome to all of you. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mukta Nayak. Dr. Mukta Nayak is trained as an architect and urban planner. She's a public policy researcher focused on urban housing, livelihoods, and internal migration. Her work experience spans research, policy advisory, and advocacy, including working with diverse stakeholders such as government, technical experts, design professionals, academia, unions, and community leadership. She is committed to working with the equitable and sustainable policy design solutions for very complex urban problems. She's also taught architecture, design, planning, and social science programs in various universities across India in different capacities. Mukta, it really is a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for taking time out to do this lecture for us on migrant housing. Over to you.
Housing has generally in India been seen from the perspective of home ownership. That's been the traditional policy position, and India, already rural India, has very high levels of home ownership because people do tend to live in land that they own, even if it's small parcels. But in urban India, we know that urban poverty manifests differently, and ownership is not always an easy within reach of the urban poor. But when it comes to migrants in the city, there are more complications, and there is a lot of overlap between the category that we call the urban poor and the category that we call rural urban migrants. So my work has been sort of trying to look at this more carefully, and I wanted to today offer you a picture of how housing is really an important asset and an important service in the form of rental housing for migrants to be able to, place their footholds in the city and really take advantage of the economic migration that they have done. So migrants who come to work in the city and who want to improve their socioeconomic status through their migration require stable housing in order to really make a success of this move from the village to the city. That's the central thought, underlying thought today. But to back up, if we look at urban housing in general and we sort of focus on who is not served well by urban housing, we know that in 2012, the Mahua Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs Technical Group estimated a housing shortage of 17.8 million. 96% of this shortage was for in the economically weaker and low income group segments. And though the figure of housing shortage, and this is ownership housing, this is how many people do not own homes, or how many homes we need in urban India in order to achieve full home ownership. This figure of housing shortage keeps changing and adjusting from time to time. A recent report this year, we exit at 9.4 million, but this issue of most of this shortage being experienced by the low income segment remains. So that's the segment that's not being able to afford to buy homes in the city. Rental housing has therefore appeared as a crucial solution for housing migrants. Like I already said, the category of migrants and urban poor can be quite overlapping. Normally, migrants who come to the city work in the city in the unorganized workforce. So they work as drivers, as waste pickers, as street vendors, increasingly as gig workers, as domestic help. They are whom we recognize as the urban poor in the city. Though not urban, all urban poor are migrants. A large percentage of them are. Uh, this For this segment, rental housing is a crucial solution because it acts as a foothold. Once they have housing, they can acquire skills, they can build networks, and they can move slowly from precarious to regular employment. Analysis of data shows us that regular employment, that is, when a migrant comes in and moves from temporary, ad hoc employment to regular employment, that's when they actually experience a clear wage differential between what they earned in the village versus what they earn in the city. So that's really the goal for the migrant, and stable housing is important for that. We'll talk more about what kind of housing choices migrants make. And then, of course, home ownership signals longer term integration into the city. So, when migrants stay long enough, are able to save, are able to build strong networks, and are able to own homes, that's really the point at which they feel integrated into the city. They become city dwellers. This is a very difficult step for low income migrants, especially those from rural backgrounds. However, in India, a lot of migration is characterized by circular and seasonal movements. That is, migrants move between the city and the village multiple times. They don't make a one step permanent long term migration, and we know that this is a large number. So if 450 million in the last census were long term migrants, uh, there are informal estimates from various groups through field studies that about maybe up to 150 million are circular and seasonal migrants. And these migrants may not be seeking ownership or long term housing, and may actually be looking at viable rental options. So, developing a strong supply of rental housing, of affordable rental housing, is really beneficial for the city, because then it attracts the migrant labor force in, which performs many jobs, many support jobs, many essential services, many dirty and dangerous jobs that a more stable and a middle income population is not really willing to do. To back up, if we look at the larger picture of rentals in India, we see that about a third, less than a third, about 27-28% of urban housing is given out on rent. And this has been a stable figure over consecutive census. So India doesn't have, like some countries in Western Europe, for instance, doesn't have a very large segment of rental housing. However, there is a higher share of rental housing in relatively urbanized states in southern India and Western India, and less in Northern India, except for hilly regions, larger metropolitan regions, where we see a lot more mobility and a lot more people coming in from outside into cities to work. There are fewer rental households in urban slums than non slums. And let's keep in mind that the data that's captured by the census is formal rental housing, so rental housing that has some sort of rental contract or agreement. And so it's not surprising that in slums where land tenure is not secure, where people don't have papers and titles to their housing, they don't they may not declare the rentals. They may not declare if they are giving out space on rent. But as the data stands, we see that the larger cities have higher share of rentals, and with in general in urban India, non-slum, that is planned neighborhoods, have higher shares of rentals than slum neighborhoods, and larger cities have higher share of rentals than smaller cities. So in this picture, where do labor migrants live? This, I think, became very evident during COVID. My work in the informal rental space started in about 2013-14, so predates COVID, and I've been tracking, this question of where labor migrants in cities live, and my field sites are in Delhi and Gurgaon and other locations in the NCR. But in COVID, we really saw that there was a wide spectrum of places where migrants were living. So they were living on work sites, on factory floors, in buildings that are under construction. So construction workers often live in buildings that they are working on, or on the edges of those buildings in temporary accommodation. Domestic help who are migrant live inside other people's home. Insecure housing in squatter settlements, informal rentals, and we'll speak a lot more about this particular categories, and even in homeless shelters in cities that offer these kinds of facilities. If we look at rental policy over time, and of course, this has to be seen in the context of the overall housing policy in India, we see that post independence, there was some focus on rentals, and especially employer created rentals. And I'm saying this because, the current situation where a lot of rentals actually exist in the informal space has a historical background. And I just wanted to give you a sense of that. So we look at this historically. We see that in the 50s, we saw schemes for rental housing for industrial workers, so employer built housing basically, plantation workers, government employees, and so on. Um, but there were also in place rent control acts across states, which kept rents, which sealed rents at a very low level. This over time has caused the degradation of housing stock, because employers have not been invested in really keeping the housing stock in repair and up to code. So this sort of housing is sort of in a limbo state, where renters do not leave, they have long term leases, and the housing deteriorates over time, ultimately being forced to go in for redevelopment. Then, of course, we had a turn in the housing policy, where the state took a more a backseat, in the sense of became the facilitator rather than the provider of housing. And this was progressively seen, and in 2007, the National Urban Housing and Habitat Policy really puts out the goal of affordable housing for all in these terms for the first time, with the government taking a facilitator and regulator role, and expecting the private sector to step in through public private partnerships and through private real estate development to supply housing. Um, in 2008, a high level task force on affordable housing actually endorsed the need to enhance the supply of rental housing, especially for the urban poor, AWS and LIG. So, this has been in the policy consciousness, the need to supply rental housing for the poor, many of whom are migrants, for quite a while now. It also recommended, the task force recommended setting up a regulator to track rents, to initiate research on rental price indices, and to facilitate PPPs in the production and management of rental housing. These are important because these are still sort of tasks, policy tasks, and goals that we are working through in the present time, and we'll talk more about that. In recent times, in 2021, the government of India enacted a Model Tenancy Act as a measure to encourage homeowners to rent. This basically is to activate a rental market where middle income and high income homeowners generally are reluctant to give out their homes on rent, because they fear that they will not be able to repossess their homes from renters. This is, of course, a legacy of rent control laws and other tenancy laws, which have been maybe favoring tenants a little bit, and there's a risk of having to go to the courts, and then these kind of things being dragged out. So there is a problem of vacant housing, which was also flagged in the last census. Following this and sort of moving from this, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs had worked on a draft policy for urban rental housing, which again targets mobile job seekers, so migrants, and lower income groups who cannot afford ownership housing. Also, many other groups like students, young workers, single men, single women, migrant workers, uh, all of these kind of categories were not looking for ownership housing in the immediate term. But this has not been it hasn't seen the light of day, this policy. Building on this policy, however, during COVID, the government did come out with an affordable rental housing complexes scheme, when they saw that the lack of housing, or the lack of good quality and secure housing, was also one of the drivers of the migrant exodus from millions of migrants away from cities back to their villages during COVID. This ARHC scheme envisages private sector concessionaires, so it's very consistent with the government's policy approach of PPP, where these concessionaires are supposed to come in and retrofit buildings or build new rentals and manage them for 25 years. And this particular ARHC component has now been absorbed into the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana 2.0. There is also an initiative now for what they call safe, secure, affordable, flexible, and efficient housing, which focuses on migrant worker hostels and industrial locations. So, what I'm trying to say is that a policy that for decades focused largely on ownership housing has now started looking at rentals as something that's important to look at. But if we look at what migrants want, from housing, what determines their housing choice, even if they are looking for at rental housing. This insight is from my own research, as well as from a study we did of the initial takeoff of the RHC scheme during COVID, where we looked at 7 cities and key informants from 19 communities in these cities. And we saw that the range of rental was very, very high among migrant renters. The surveys and the interactions were done with informal sector workers, many of them are migrants. And what migrants are looking for depends, in terms of housing, depends on the duration of their migration. So, how long they've been in the city, what sector they work in. So, do they work from home? Do they need to be on work, very proximal to the work site? Like, for example, in construction, workers are often required to be at the work site all the time. What kind of intermediaries they come through. So, if migrant workers are brought in groups by labor contractors, these contractors are often instrumental in getting them housing. And so, therefore, the form of housing sort of gets determined by the kind of arrangements that contractors can make. These can be sort of mass housing in peri-urban areas in the city. Then, of course, whether migrants are coming alone or whether they are bringing their families over makes a huge difference. Are you expected to cater for the education of children? Are you expected to cater for the safety of women and young girls? And all of this factors in, other than the other factors that are more obvious, which is affordability and income. How much can they pay for their housing, how close they need it to be to work, what are their social networks, do they want to live near people who speak the same language, share cultural attributes, and so on and so forth. So these are, of course, very important factors. But what's holding back formal rental supply? So we know that this particular segment of migrants, we almost never find them in formal housing, formal rental housing, because formal rental housing itself has not been produced in large numbers. The first, of course, reason is, of course, what we've already talked about before, where private individual homeowners are not very excited about putting their housing, in the rental market. So individual small scale private actors hesitate to participate in the rental market, where they feel they are disadvantaged by rent control laws. Repossession can be difficult. But also the experiments with public rental housing, the few that have happened across the country, have not worked very well, and this has then inhibited further public sector participation. So we don't have housing boards, development authorities building housing for rental. They do build housing for ownership. And of course, when this housing is built as relocation or resettlement for slum dwellers, then there are conditions in which these slum dwellers cannot sell. I mean, it's not a freehold tenure that they get. They cannot sell that housing to somebody else, but they do have lease rights, use rights to that housing for a certain period of time. It could be 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, depending on the project, terms and conditions. We also find, hear from developers that the institutional, private sector is reluctant because rental yields are not as high as they expect. And of course, affordable housing policy has still largely remained focused on ownership. So even though we see some recognition of rental housing now, there is no robust rental housing policy framework that actually encourages developers to enter this in a very concerted manner. And on the other side, of course, even if we did have formal rental housing, this may not suit migrants. And there are a few very clear reasons for this. First is rental housing, formal landlords would expect regular monthly payments, but many migrant workers are engaged in informal casual work where they may be being paid daily or weekly, or they may not work for certain amounts of time, and their work may not be regular and payment frequencies fluctuate. So they need a lot of flexibility when it comes to payment terms. They're also located, a lot of the formal rentals and the formal affordable housing in general is often located, and this we specifically found in the case of the ARHC Model 1 projects. This model is where, unallocated or unused affordable housing, which was previously built under various schemes, is converted to rental. And we found that here, these projects were located so far away from employment hubs or from service, areas where which offered good services, that it was very difficult for migrants to really rent here. Migrants require proximity to workplaces to minimize their transport costs and maximize the time they spend actually working and earning money. This is crucial for migrant households. Then the third reason, of course, is that management expertise. And if you remember, this was flagged by the working, group right up in, back in 2016, sorry, 2012, 13. Management expertise for social rentals is not really very highly developed. These need special procedures and knowledge on how to allocate rental housing, how to manage vacancies, how to deal with evictions, how to set appropriate rents, collection mechanisms, and so on and so forth. And this, again, in countries where rental housing is a very big part of the market, one of the big investments has been actually investing in rental management companies, professionalized rental management companies. This is a missing area in India, and is will probably develop if the rentals are given a more institutional and formalized push. And of course, what I want to talk more about is the informal rental practices. These are the rental practices that actually meet market demands today. This is where people are actually living in the absence of adequate and affordable formal rentals. The urban poor and migrant populations are living in informal rental accommodations, but this whole set of practices has remained under acknowledged, and it's not an area that the government has really looked at as an area of intervention. So, I'll talk a little bit about this because it tells us a lot about what migrants want and expect, and what could work both for migrants as well as for the providers of rental supply. And it could give us some clues as to how to frame rental policy for migrant populations. So, I'm speaking from my fieldwork in Gurgaon here, where these two urban villages of Nathapur and Sikandarpur, which are on the right side of this map, um, are where I have done my field work. And as you can see, in the area is an industrial area, an area of high-end offices, retail, residential, high-end residential. So a lot of work options for migrants, which makes these urban villages a very prime sort of locations for migrants to live in. What I found was that there is a range, and anybody who will walk around the low income areas of their cities and walk around areas where migrants generally live will see this huge range of housing that is produced in these places, from jhuggies to tenements where there is a corridor, double loaded corridor with rooms, and inside each room there may be single men sharing the rooms, or there may be families all sharing a room. Then there are slightly more upgraded sets, like there are room sets which may have, like, where two, three rooms may have access to one set of toilet and bathroom, and there may be better light and ventilation, parking for bikes, etc. And of course, even more upgraded hostels, PGs, small apartments. So this whole range of migrants from very low income to sort of at the bottom end of the middle income spectrum, they live in these kind of housing arrangements. Um, there are also working women's hostels, studios, co-living. Some of these are informal. Some of these have also crossed over into the informal, into the formal space, as in there are formal companies now and aggregators and digital platforms that are providing these kind of the kind of housing that is at the higher end of this segment. But let's come back to informal rental housing, which provides housing to low income workers and migrants. um, and I'd like to really think through with you how informal rentals actually act as footholds. So here, uh, these rentals are provided by owners and landlords who are small to medium scale housing providers. So, what I mean to say here is that I may be someone who's living in an urban village or an unauthorized colony, or a low income colony, middle income colony, and I may add rooms to my own home and rent them out. I may add floors above my home and rent them out. I may buy additional plots in an adjacent colony and create rental housing, of the kind that I just showed you, and rent them out. So anything that is below 10 units, we consider a very small scale, a petty scale, landlordism. And then what I found in these urban villages that I worked in is that there are also landlords who then grow this and scale this up as a business. And they may have 30, 40, 50 units in multiple sites in places where they, are able to acquire land, and then they manage these rental housing. So this rental housing actually becomes an important income for landlords, but they don't get, in the informal scenario, they don't get any recognition by the state. So this is an untapped potential for growing rental housing, because the provision is happening, the renting is happening, the supply is coming, but it's not registered in any way by the state, and it's not really counted into the numbers and the data on rental housing. What is interesting about informal rentals is that it meets the needs of the migrant worker, which are very diverse and complex. So, flexible location close to work is something that migrants need, and these housings are able to meet those needs. Uh, but there are also risks associated with it, because the contracts between migrant tenants and these landlords are not formalized contracts, they are oral contracts. So they are enforced by social power relations in the market, not by paperwork, not by anything legal. And therefore, there is a threat of eviction, there is a threat of arbitrary rent increases, there may be compromises to quality and safety, and differentiated experiences that migrants have across, caste, gender, language, and culture. So women may experience some sort of surveillance, lower castes may experience certain kinds of marginalization. Landlords may discriminate against migrants from a certain part of the country. So there is no recourse, like there is nothing the migrant can do to complain or to take a grievance somewhere or to contest these kind of negative experiences. So, to conclude and to sum this up, we have this large amount of informal rental housing, which is produced in all our cities, vast amounts in metropolitan cities, in slums, in unauthorized colonies, in urban villages, or literally in any kind of land that is affordable, and where, small and medium scale entrepreneurs can actually invest and grow this business. But this is not right now being folded into the formal spectrum. So, what can we do if we recognize housing as an important foothold for migrants? We recognize that being able to afford decent quality housing where their children can, study without impediments, where their family can, avail of good health. So basically, well lit, well ventilated housing with basic amenities like water, toilets. These are important. These are important for migrant families in order to improve their socioeconomic status and eventually become urban residents, or even to live in the city in a convenient and in a productive way for the 20, 30, 40 years that they choose to live there, and then return to their villages. So what can be done to boost it? On the formal rental housing side, formal rental housing has not yet considered the complexity of migrant demand. Here we have some opportunities in the private sector. We actually are finding tech-enabled platforms are interested in easing the discovery process, or contributing to the management, to ease the management of rentals. There is a dire need for financial products that can address the issue of irregular income. So, informal workers who have irregular incomes, their incomes may be adequate to pay rent, but it doesn't come regularly in a monthly fashion. Products to sort of tide them over the lean periods is something that these are the kind of services or opportunities that the private sector has. Here, the most vulnerable segments, the working homeless, women and child migrants, especially single women households, are still highly reliant on the government for support. And so here, there have been other countries have experimented with subsidies, voucher systems, etc., to support particularly vulnerable categories of renters for whom working is important. I think this is important to flag as India is focusing on increasing the workforce participation of women, and many women work in the informal sector. So, also subsidizing their rental housing or helping them access better rental housing could be a part of that solution, that larger solution. And employers, of course, can play a role by actually tying up with housing entrepreneurs, and tying up with online platforms which aggregate different kinds of housing entrepreneurs in order to help their employees to access quality housing, quality and affordable housing. On the informal side, the first thing we need, of course, is recognition itself. We need to recognize this informal supply in some way. We need to work out finance credit to providers of housing so that they can build better, build more, build to code. Currently, a lot of this housing is substandard. So, some form of recognition will also come with perhaps some basic standards of quality. Uh, they need municipal services in many of the neighborhoods where they build. The neighborhoods are still sort of being developed. They may not have piped water, they may not have sewerage systems yet. So, just improving the municipal services and infrastructure in areas which are ripe for rental housing provision is a good way to secure housing for migrant workers and informal sector workers. And of course, management capacity building. So these are landlords who are just growing their businesses without the actual training on how to manage rentals. And this could be a huge, in my field work, I've heard this often from landlords that this would help them a lot. The government could use these as incentives to boost registration, so encourage landlords to register their rental units, improve quality. These will also require special urban planning regulation for these zones that are sort of what I call rent rich zones, where you may need to relax certain regulations, or you may need to make special sort of regulations which allow for dense rental housing to come up in these areas. It may also have different norms for infrastructure provision as compared to single family homes. Um, we need new, more flexible forms of tenancy contracts. Currently, the Tenancy Act does not recognize anything other than registered leases, whereas most of the supply is unregistered and informal. So it's a very high bar. So can we lower the bar a little bit, be more flexible to allow for more recognition and more visibility? Because when these rentals become visible, they also become better. That's the presumption, and that's the experience. That's been the experience across the developing world, across the global south, that registering and visibilizing informal rentals inevitably leads to an increase in quality, of this supply. And of course, there have also been solutions in terms of incentives like tax breaks, or like not charging. If people declare rental housing, then they shouldn't be considered as it shouldn't be considered as a commercial income, and they should be given some kind of relief in that regard. So there are many ways in which there can be this segment can be encouraged, and with these measures in place, we would possibly be able to make cities more friendly for migrants, and ensure that we have the labor supply to power the engines of economic growth that we expect our cities to be. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much, Mukta. Thanks so much for taking us through the entire landscape of migrant housing, really, which is so critical. And, I think what's really evident from your talk is the fact that the informality in the housing market cannot be de-linked from the informality in the labor market, right? So it's so closely and intricately linked there. So, in this context, and I've always had this pressing question, we are a developing country, we are urbanizing. So, eventually, if we have to urbanize more, I'm just curious to know, how is it that the entire mass or a considerable mass of rural population will move to urban areas without, how will this housing problem be, I don't know, solved, taken care of? Because clearly it's one of the fundamental, it's like, like you mentioned, it's hardly studied, but it's also one of the critical reasons why many migrants are unable to sort of have a permanent foothold in the city, right? So I just wanted to, like, hear your thoughts on how is it that we can overcome this paradox of an increasingly developing country which is not urbanizing like it should, and that's largely, to me it seems, housing is a crucial factor there. So if you could, like, I don't know, share some policy advice or ways of looking at it, linking it with urbanization. If you could, like, throw some light on that, it'll be very useful.
Absolutely. I think this question of seasonality and circularity and the hesitant urbanization is key, because the migrant worker, even if they want to, is not really able to break through into the urban market. Housing is one part, and of course the informality, the labor informality. They work very much in tandem with each other, which is why rentals is a lower. So producing ownership housing, given the fact that land prices are high in our cities, land is a very coveted resource, that we are still grappling with large amounts of land in cities being sort of unavailable for planned development, because there are either land disputes, or there are slums on it, or there are many of these issues. The rental segment is sort of a way to uh, maybe provide a holding, like just keep them in holding pattern till we are able to figure out other solutions. This is becoming quite difficult in our metropolitan cities, where I think developers have already acquired large amounts of land banks, and moving developers to build affordable housing has been quite hard. It's very difficult for them to make the numbers work. Unless the government offers huge subsidies. Basically, if they have to buy the land, they cannot provide housing which is truly affordable. They can call it affordable, but it's 30 lakhs, which is not affordable for migrant workers. It may be affordable for white collar workers, at who can buy homes maybe younger, at a younger age than what was conventionally in India the home buying age, which was basically closer to retirement. That's changed now. uh, the other thing, I think, the opportunity that we are looking at now is the small and medium cities, especially medium sized cities, where I think a lot of the employment will shift. So this right now it's still very metro focused. We know that the productivity high productivity centers are still very much metros and the areas around metros, but there is now a concerted in the budget, as well as Niti Aayog sort of growth hubs push. There is a push towards looking at medium and second tier cities as growth hubs, which could. And here is where I think we really need to look for the opportunity for rental, for affordable housing, for entry level housing, and for a very entrepreneurial sort of way. Like, how do you invite housing entrepreneurs to come in and create the housing that you need? And how do you make that housing, and speaking as an architect, flexible, so that it can keep being repurposed as the life cycle changes? So for instance, you may have right now at the edge of a city an industry that, say, electronics, that employs a lot of women migrant workers. So your need today is large dormitories for single migrant women, but 20 years later that need may change, and those industrial settings that opportunity may change, something else may come. So I think we're looking at from a building construction technology perspective, from a how do you set up actually this business perspective? We're looking at this kind of, we need to think of housing being churned over every 15, 20 years as the economy shifts. But what's clear and what's underpinning all of this is that migration is what is going to get labor to where we need it to be. So we need to not sort of beat up on migrants, or think of it as a negative thing, but actually think of it as an opportunity, both for those individuals and households who are engaging in the migration and wanting a better life for themselves, as well as for our cities. who are then acquiring these productive workers. We should invest in their productivity, and housing is one really easy and really solid way to do that.
Right, yeah. No, thanks, Mukta, really, for focusing on housing. And like I said, it is so less studied in the literature on labor, in the literature on migration, and it's really one of those missing blocks. So it was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time out and doing this with us today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
So that was Dr. Mukta Nayak, who gave us a perspective on migrant housing, based on her own research experience over several decades in the context of urban India. So you can see, we saw how the issue of migrant housing is something which is so critical, yet as we understood from her talk, it's hardly studied. Much of the policy interventions have been in the space of low income and focusing not on migrant housing, but low income housing and so on. And as she mentioned, like over time, because land prices have gone up so much and because of all kinds of speculative investment in land and housing, it's a serious issue. The lack of housing or the housing crunch is a serious issue for migrants. And it's also one of the things that we have is that we don't really have too many theories of housing as such, right? It's largely a policy arena. And then you can also see how policy around migration and how policy around migrant housing has been one of deregulation. So therefore, the state earlier was more involved in housing policy. Now it's more of a public-private partnership model. But what ends up happening is that migrants actually live in pretty low quality housing, poor quality housing, and it's a market which is unregulated. And this is not a small problem. It's a huge problem because the way rural urban migration is imagined, the way urbanization is imagined, eventually the idea is that bit by bit the rural population will move to urban areas. But if housing is so expensive and such a constraint, then urbanization, the way it's historically happened or the way even our state imagines it, will not happen and is not happening. So housing, of course, the right to housing is important. It's an end in itself, but it's also the means to certain other ends, right? And for the state's development goal, housing is very, very important. And it's rather unfortunate, I feel, that it's not given as much policy importance as it should. And it's rather unfortunate, I believe, that it's not given as much policy importance as it should. And when it intersects with migration and migrants, the exclusion is even more stark. So with that, we come to the end of this module, and we were very thankful to Dr. Mukta Nayak, who spoke on migrant housing, and I hope you found the talk useful. Thank you.